Welcome to Call to the Bar, International Law Over Drinks, a series of informal conversations about current issues in international law, life in academia, and whatever else is on our mind. In these conversations, we're speaking off the cuff and without the benefit of footnotes, and nothing we say should be taken to have been thoroughly peer-reviewed. I'm Dr. Ntina Tzouvala, I'm your host for today. I'm an associate professor at UNSW here in Sydney. And today I am extremely glad and grateful to be joined by Professor Ardi Imseis. He's an associate professor at Queen's Law School, and he's a scholar practitioner of public international law. He came to academia from the UN. He is a former UN official with UNRWA, as well as with the UNHCR between 2002 and 2014, and as well as a member of the UN Commission of Inquiry on Yemen between 2019 and 2021. He has also served as legal counsel and advocate in cases before the International Court of Justice, indeed most recently in the advisory proceedings concerning the obligations of Israel in relation to the presence and activities of the UN and other international organizations and third states in and in relation to the occupied Palestinian territory. He has given expert testimony in his personal capacity before other high-level bodies, including the UN Security Council and the UN Human Rights Council. He is the author of the United Nations and the Question of Palestine that was published by CUP in 2023. We are going to include a link to this under the pod. And he's also the former editor-in-chief of the Palestine Yearbook of International Law that he served between 2008 and 2019, and as well as Harlan Fiske Stone Scholar and Human Rights Fellow at Columbia Law School. He has a PhD from Cambridge, an LLM from Columbia, an LLB from Dalhousie, and a BA from the University of Toronto. And today, Ardi is joining me to talk about the upcoming UN General Assembly meeting, where a number of Western states, including Australia, where our pod is based, are expected to officially recognize the State of Palestine. So, Ardi, you're a new guest in our pod, and the question that we ask many of our guests is to tell us a little bit about your career path, and in particular, how you got involved with international law practice and scholarship.
Sure, Dina, thanks very much for inviting me to address your audience and to be in conversation with you. I hold you in high regard, as do many in our community, and it is an honor to be here with you. I mean, for as long as I can recall, even as a child, I was always interested in geography, and as it happens, football. Football is an international sport, and so all I did as a child was pore over these maps and these atlases and think about my life in the world, as it were. It was inevitable that I would study international relations as an undergraduate at U of T. And I went to law school with the goal of making sure that I establish a career somehow in the international multilateral system. And that's precisely what happened. But it was more my life as an international lawyer, my life into the United Nations and then into international law through that was all an organic development of something that just was there for as long as I could recall. I don't particularly know why, but it was. I worked between 2002 and 2014, as you'd mentioned, in occupied Palestine with UNRWA. I was legal counsel and a senior policy advisor to them at headquarters Gaza. I lived for about 4.5 years in Gaza, and then 7.5 in East Jerusalem, and so on, with, of course, work in the region, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and so on. And it was interesting because I write about this in my foreword to the book, or rather in the preface to the book. Forgive me, the acknowledgments of the book, that it was my experience. I came to the United Nations as a positivist international law person. And it was my experience as a practitioner where constantly principles were running up against just the fact of realpolitik and sheer force, brute force. that frustration, that tension between those two things that led me to more of a critical examination of international law. I won't say that I'm as critical as somebody like you or many of our 12 colleagues, but of course we are big enough to admit that within the pantheon of 12 scholars, there are different degrees of crit, if you like. I still am very much a practitioner and see the value in what I call the counter-hegemonic potential of international law. And I borrow that from others like Diane Otto in particular. So yeah, I mean, that was my career. And then I decided mid-career to end my UN life and then become an academic. So I did. And I've been ever since 2018, one foot in the practice and one foot as an academic.
That's fantastic. That's really interesting to hear, especially what you said about being a positivist or a formalist whose practice pushed him more towards critique or towards theory, right? That's not usually the, let's say, stereotypical view of the critical or even critical adjacent legal scholar. So I have invited you here today because I think you're one of the most qualified people to talk about what we have been witnessing the last few months. And the fact in particular that in light of escalating violence and spreading famine in Gaza, a number of Western states, including, as I said before, Australia, have declared their intention to officially recognize the State of Palestine in the upcoming UN General Assembly meeting. And we will get back to the question of recognition, but I wanted to take a little bit of a step back and ask you. Obviously, Palestine is not a UN member state. We can talk about why that is the case. But nevertheless, the United Nations, and I would say specifically the UN General Assembly, has long been a forum for the Palestinian struggle for self-determination. And as I said also in the introduction, your own work, including your monograph, concerns the evolution between the so-called question of Palestine and the United Nations. So can we take a step back? Can you tell us a little bit about how this relationship has evolved to bring us to this moment of upcoming recognition in a few weeks from today?
Yeah, a big question, but I'm happy to at least begin our conversation on it, and I'm sure there will be threads that we carry on into the other questions that we will look into. There's a great deal in 80 years of history of the United Nations. There's a great deal of issues that have been on its agenda, but none more prominent, none for as long as the question of Palestine. The organization is established in 1945, October, if my recollection serves. And by May or so, 1947, less than 2 years later, the question of Palestine is placed on its agenda by the British who quit the mandate to Palestine. And from that day onward, the United Nations has not been able to resolve, such as their capacity is to resolve the question. One of the things that I found in my research and in my engagement as a practitioner was there was this odd thing. Most of us as international lawyers will be aware of a certain case called the reparations case, of course, and this came out of the ICJ in 1948, and it concerned the legal personality of the United Nations. And any international lawyer will know this case because it establishes the legal personality of the United Nations as an international organization, as an organization that enjoys privileges and immunities, may waive those privileges and immunities in certain circumstances, and so on. But what I found interesting is that very few international lawyers are aware of the fact that the facts of the case that gave rise to the reparations ratio, if you want to call it, right, all took place in Palestine. They had to do with the assassination by the Zionist movement, then certain elements of the Zionist movement of Count Folke Bernadotte, who was the United Nations mediator for Palestine. And what I found was there's a metaphor in that, and I treat this in the preface to my book, that if you read the reparations decision, you will find that there is opinion rather. You will find that there is no reference made at all to the facts that gave rise to the case. There's no reference to Bernadotte. There's no reference to Jerusalem. There's no reference to Palestine, Jerusalem, the place where he was killed. There's no reference at all to Palestine and so on. And so that silence to me was metaphorical. because the UN owes its legal existence to events that emanate from Palestine. That is to say, its legal personality, I should be fair. And yet, it has yet to be able to allow Palestinians their full rights on the international plane. So the relationship over time between Palestine and the UN is very close. It's organically connected to one another. And you see this, and I draw this out in my book, through key moments in time from 1947 and the purported partition by the General Assembly of Palestine to the legal regime that was established by the organization in the immediate aftermath of the Nakba of 1948-49 to deal with the fallout of the Nakba being the Palestine refugee problem. There's a whole unique international legal institutional framework focused on Palestinian refugees. To the manner in which the United Nations has managed or mismanaged, depends on how you're looking at it, the question of the occupied Palestinian territory post 1967 for the past 60 years or so, all the way up to Palestine's attempt to gain full membership in the organization from 2011 to the very present. And even now, and these facts post-date the publication of my book, but even now, with the genocide happening in Palestine and the manner in which the UN has managed or not sufficiently the challenges brought there. So there are these signposts throughout the UN's management of the question of Palestine that demonstrate to me one fundamental thing, that there is a condition that I call international legal subalternity, the essence of which posits that the international organized community of states through the UN holds out international law and organization to various groups, weaker groups, as the only way they can achieve some form of justice. In this case, the Palestinians embody these weaker groups. And yet, with every step taken towards that body of law or that international organization being the United Nations, with every engagement of the subaltern group, the Palestinian group, in this promise, the goalposts just seem inevitably to shift. And ironically, by the very actions of the United Nations itself, right? This is a pattern that I see across time and I've been able to demonstrate in my research. And it continues to this very day. There are many different examples of it. We can talk about that. The obvious main one was the events of 1947 and the purported partition of Palestine and what that meant for the Palestinian people and the results of which remain with us to this day. But so I argue that there's this condition, and uniquely, it's not only for Palestinians, but you can see this condition of international legal subalternity attaching to different individuals, different groups, different subaltern or weaker actors on the international plane.
Fantastic. Thank you. And of course, yes, I'm well aware that I asked you a very broad question. So this is obviously in the form of vignettes. And it's interesting because I was reading the other day the Mavromatis case from the PCIJ, right? In which again we teach very often, especially as a question of diplomatic protection, right? And the state stepping in to offer diplomatic protection to individuals, in that case, Greece stepping in for Mavromatis. And it was so interesting to me that I was reading the case, and this was almost fully a case about the lawfulness or not of Britain's presence in Palestine, right, as a mandatory, right? And it's so interesting that obviously there the PCIJ does mention a little bit more of the facts, but it is so interesting to me the way we teach it then strips it from all this context and also from all this contest, right, about the very many problems with Britain's position as a mandatory, and we just treat it as this sort of like technical, almost like human rights case about diplomatic protection. So it's interesting to me, like what you said about the ICJ making Palestine disappear in the reparations advisory opinion. We can see it in so many other parts of our field, this act of disappearing Palestine.
And you know what's interesting as you raise this with me is that at the same time, if you were to juxtapose what Palestine is presently doing at the ICJ and its friends and comrades are doing at the ICJ, this is this demonstrates, and have as I say, I have the great honor of being part of the Palestinian legal team in doing this. I speak now in my personal capacity, of course. But what this demonstrates to me, if you juxtapose what you just described as the PCIJ's management of Mavrumatis and then my discussion of reparations, and you contrasted with the active, robust use of the ICJ by Palestine in the global South, South Africa, and so on, from the Wall opinion onward, you can see exactly the theme that I've tried to set out in my book, which is the UN is at once, and these international institutions, because you've mentioned the PCIJ, of course, wasn't part of the UN formally, they are at once part of a problem, but then can also be part of a solution if used tactically, if used creatively, also understanding the limits of international law. Law will not liberate, law cannot liberate, but it can serve as a useful tool to help advance the cause of liberation. One of the things that jumped out at me as well as you were talking was this problem that we have as lawyers. In a sense, I don't blame the ICJ for not speaking about Palestine in the reparations case, because sometimes, oftentimes lawyers will be very technical. Oftentimes with reference cases, as we call them in Canada, or advisory opinion cases, the facts don't really matter. I mean, some facts don't matter. You just need to isolate a legal question and answer it. So it's the technical vocation that we have as positivist lawyers, if you like, formalist lawyers, that strips naturally, epistemologically, strips context away in order to make matters easier to analyze. And this is the problem in our discipline. So, in a sense, I wear two hats. Like I can get all of that, but at the same time, I also recognize we live in a real political world, a world full of states where things get done through these institutions. And so you necessarily have to play by those rules sometimes, as I do when I'm engaged in the ICJ work, and to find out, where the creative entry points are for action. And, such as, for instance, why recognition now by
Yes.
these Western states? Is that a creative entry point? Things like that.
Fantastic. Thank you. Yes, no, I agree entirely that very often it's not, this act of erasure is not the result of like bad intention. Sometimes it is, but
Oh, they were, yeah, in the 19th
yes,
century for sure. Yeah. And
but
also in the League of
sometimes,
Nations period.
yeah, but sometimes it is the result of, as you say, the technicality of the field, right? So I'm really interested in what you raised about the recognition, right? And I'm really interested about the recognition because what I thought was striking, especially when it came, for example, to Australia's intention to recognize the state of Palestine, was Australia has said that it will make this recognition conditional upon certain requirements, including the quote unquote demilitarization, excuse me, of the state of Palestine. And in a sense, I would ask you to wear both your formalist doctrinal hat. What is this idea of conditional recognition of statehood? Is that something that sits comfortably within the doctrine of international law? But also would like you to wear the more critical hat because when I saw this, I was like, this is a case study of this international legal subalternity that Ardi is talking about, right? If this idea that certain states have to be demilitarized, their neighbors can be, armed to the teeth. So either or both questions, whichever one you take first, whichever hat you want to put on first.
Yeah, so a great question. And so the first place I want to begin with is just to speak to the moment that we're in. It is absurd, and it will be rightfully absurd to many, that you and I would be talking about recognition of the state of Palestine, and that Australia and Canada and France and the United Kingdom would be discussing this now, on the eve of the General Assembly at a time of genocide of the Palestinian people. In the history of the Palestinian people, there has never been a more threatening period of time. They literally face existential threat as continuing as a people as such, especially as a national group in their homeland as such. We can see that that's on full display. So why does recognition even matter? Like from a tactical or even positivist standpoint and so on. That's one place we can begin. Well, part of me believes that it matters because what we're witnessing right now from the Israeli occupying power is their version of a one-state solution. They want all of it, from the river to the sea. They're open about that. They've never hid their desire not to have all of it. They want the whole of the indigenous population either out of the country by force or over time by imposing conditions of life and making it impossible for them to remain there, or they want them dead. And in the face of 23 months of what the International Court of Justice says is a plausible genocide, we'll just stick with them and be conservative about it, right? The international community has done precious little to stop this onslaught. This is the world in which, the racist world in which Palestinians exist. We cannot expect the world to save us from this onslaught. And so we need to be creative by virtue of the fact that we don't have the same material resources at our disposal as the Israeli occupying power. We don't have a military that can defend its people in any real way. There is no real war going on. Where are these pitched battles between, the Palestinian paramilitaries in their thousands and the Israelis? They don't exist. This is a turkey shoot. The Israeli Air Force has free reign over the Gaza Strip and is bombarding a civilian population and a small group of resistors who are equipped with small arms to smithereens, and nobody is coming to their defense, not easily militarily, that's for sure. And so in a world like that, Palestinians have very little choice but to utilize every single means of resistance, lawful resistance, and so on. And that's how I view the move to have further recognitions. Let's start again from what we know. Palestine is already a state. Juridically, it's a state. It's recognized by 149 states. There are 193 member states of the United Nations and maybe only just under 200 states in the world, right? So the 149 states represent about 75% of the planet in terms of population. So these Western states like Australia, Canada, France, the United Kingdom, and others, Belgium, who are about to recognize, are basically the holdouts. They're the ones who are coming to the party late, and they're doing it grudgingly. And so does that mean that recognition by these states does not matter? No, quite the opposite. It does matter. Is there a fear that their recognition will be seen and be allowed to be merely performative? Of course. And that's the fear that many of us in our community have, and many critical international law people have. Oh, this is just performative, they'll say. They don't have any ability to impose a no-fly zone, or willingness, better, to impose a no-fly zone to protect the Palestinian people in their existential moment, their time of need. And therefore, they're going to throw the Palestinians some crumbs of recognizing the state of Palestine. And such as it is, it doesn't even exist on the ground, these people would say, by virtue of Israel's ravages and so on. Well, that's one way to look at it. But I don't think I have the luxury of being able to look at it that way. And I would encourage those who are critical about looking at it that way, as seeing it in the larger scheme of what I've tried, or context of what I've tried to paint out, which is a racist world that isn't going to save the Palestinians easily or willingly, and that the Palestinians need to use every single moment, every single opportunity to advance the cause of peace with justice. So recognition, yes. But that doesn't mean that you don't continue to pressure Canberra, Ottawa, Paris, London, etc., to do more following recognition. Recall, you'll know this, recognition is a political act. But once recognition is given, legal consequences flow from that act. So what do I mean by that? Right? From a strictly positivist standpoint, once Canberra recognizes the state of Palestine, with that recognition comes Canberra's automatic inherent recognition of, among other things, the territorial integrity and political independence of the state of Palestine, and the inherent right of Palestine to territorial integrity and political independence, the right of the Palestinian people to use self-defense when subject to an unlawful armed attack, as is the case right now, right? And so you could see how this is going to alter naturally, organically, Australia, the recognizing states' bilateral relationship with Israel, right? So recognition, yes, but you don't stop there. You have obligations now to adjust your foreign policy vis-a-vis Israel to ensure that it does nothing, that foreign policy does nothing to aid or assist in the continued violation of the territorial integrity and political independence of the state of Palestine that you just recognized. Israel is in the territory, we know, as affirmed by the International Court of Justice in July 2019, a case that I worked on for many years and served as counsel to Palestine on. We know from last summer's advisory opinion, 19 July, that Israel's physical presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, the state of Palestine, is in and of itself unlawful. And that requires that Israel not negotiate the end of its presence there. No, you don't negotiate the end of an internationally wrongful act. And by recognizing the state of Palestine, Australia, Canada, and France have made for themselves, will make for themselves an even greater case, which they already have now, but an even greater case, imperative really, to not aid or assist Israel in its continued aggression in Palestine. For every minute that passes, Israel is there as an aggressor. Israel has but one obligation: to vacate occupied Palestine. It enjoys no right of self-defense to justify its physical presence in that territory, period. That's a complete nonsense, right? Because you cannot justify an aggression with reference to Article 51 of the UN Charter, which doesn't even apply here, on the strength of what the court said in 2004 in the Wall opinion. See paragraph 139 of that opinion for that proposal, or that ratio, if you like. So
To clarify
there
for the
are,
listeners, what the court said is that a state does not have the right to self-defense vis-a-vis a territory that it occupies. That is
that's
what the
right.
court said. Just everyone, so that everyone is on board with that, right?
Yes, thank you
Yes.
for that clarification.
Yeah, of
Absolutely.
course.
So all this to say that from a positivist, functional, formalist standpoint, there are legal principles that flow from recognition. Those principles offer the existence of those principles. So the sovereign equality of states is another such principle, or the principle of non-intervention into the internal affairs of a state. Once you recognize the state of Palestine, you have an obligation not to intervene in the internal affairs of Palestine. And so these principles offer entry points for further political pressure to be brought to bear on these states who are now latecomers to the party. And interestingly, they're friends of Israel. They also arm Israel, like the United Kingdom, for instance. Canada sends parts to these F-35s that Israel is using to bombard Gaza and so on. So too does the United Kingdom. So what these recognitions do is they offer an opportunity for further pressure to be brought to bear in these centers of power that Israel relies on, in the context of what is very clearly a boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that is sweeping the world in favor of the Palestinian people. The train has left the station, is what I'm trying to say on this movement. And these recognitions have to be seen as part of it, whatever some of their pitfalls. So I'm going to now shift, in answer to the second element of your question, to some of the pitfalls. Many of these states, France, certainly Australia, have the United Kingdom, they've made their recognition ostensibly conditional on certain things, right? That Palestine be demilitarized, or that, and this is an interesting one, Hamas play no role in government, right? Interestingly, the Palestinians have no problem with that formally. I'm not saying the Palestinian people, but the Palestinian leadership has made it clear, and you need to read the fine print, particularly in the New York Declaration. They've said, we've no problem having a state that is demilitarized, subject to many conditions. Read the conditions that are set out in the New York Declaration. Those conditions are very clear. Those conditions are about ensuring the international community, ensuring a protective force for the Palestinian people in the territory at the invitation of the state of Palestine, therefore would be controlled by the state of Palestine, right? They could decide if they're going to continue with this internal force or not. Um, but absent this protective force for the Palestinian people, as a sovereign, the Palestinian people could do what they like with their territory, and how they defend it would be up to them. So there's some nuance here that is lost in the critique. From the standpoint of the recognizing state, it's irrelevant. It's a red herring. It quite literally, it is a red herring. Australia, Canada, France, any other country in the world could tell country X, that they recognize that you have to be demilitarized, but we understand that in the world of sovereigns, sovereigns are king and they can do what they wish. Now, the question is whether or not, that is to say, nothing in these conditions will stop the state of Palestine eventually forming its own defense force. What will, in fact, stop it? Let's be real, right? Going back to the realist aspect of the world around us, is the sheer matter of power imbalances as between the putative state of Palestine and the juggernaut that is Israel, the apartheid genocidal state on its doorstep, which is armed to the teeth, a nuclear power. Those things may stop Palestine eventually from arming itself. So let's take a step back and ask the following question. Are any of those facts, is any of that imbalance in power going to change with or without recognition from Canberra?
Probably
The
not.
answer clearly, the
Yeah.
answer is clearly no. And so it seems to me that in a world that is unfair, that I've painted for all of us to consider, it is right and proper for Palestine to seek greater numbers of recognition, adding to those that already recognize, knowing that these will serve as tools, entry points for creative action to seek more and more justice in a world that is fundamentally unjust. And we can see over time will continue to be for the immediate term, right? So we need to be clear about how we're using, we meaning like globally, not the state of Palestine, but how recognition fits into the large piece.
A broader
Um,
strategy, yes.
into a broader strategy as a tactical move and so on. Once you recognize, you don't unrecognize. And I mean, look, let's just put it down in really concrete terms. At bottom, what Israel is doing in the Gaza Strip is destroying the Palestinian group as a national group, as such, in their homeland. They have been open about their desire to drive that whole population outside of their national homeland. What better a way to send Israel the message that this will not be recognized than by having its friendly states, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, tell the Israelis that no matter what they do on the ground, their claim to sovereignty over the occupied Palestinian territory will never be recognized, that this belongs to one sovereign and one sovereign only, the Palestinian people, to the exclusion of all other people. And Israel has but one obligation: to vacate, and to do so now. And this is the last point. The General Assembly, the court last September, 2024, 19 July, not September, when the court determined that Israel's presence was unlawful, the General Assembly received that opinion and determined that Israel has a 1 year deadline to vacate from the territory. The court initially said Israel has a deadline, has the obligation to leave the territory, quote, as rapidly as possible.
Yes.
Then the General Assembly set a deadline of 18 September 2025, which is just next
Great
week,
things.
right?
Yes.
Yeah, we're recording this on the 15th now of September. Um, and so what this means is when the Israelis overstay their welcome, there will inevitably be consequences to that. Now, what those consequences look like, who knows? But there are greater calls for trade sanctions, greater calls for diplomatic sanctions, greater calls for all manner of different sanctions. And the recognition piece fits into this larger strategy of isolating the
Yes.
pariah state of Israel.
Absolutely. So the way I hear what you're saying in a sense is recognition obviously is an imperfect strategy, but it's an imperfect strategy in a wildly imperfect world, right? In which
Right,
Palestinians obviously have to come both to the actual political table, but also to the legal table at a position of disadvantage. And of course, that means the number of moves available seem to not be endless, right? That's how I read it, that look, recognition comes with all sorts of limitations and it can be a distraction. But in a sense, I would say, especially for those of us who are worried that it is a distraction, I would say it is incumbent upon us to make sure that it isn't, to put it like that,
right,
right? Even those that like the more maybe critical people who are concerned that this is a sort of like tactical maneuver by Western states to recognize the state while letting people get slaughtered. it is in a sense incumbent upon us to make sure that we attach legal and political consequences to something that perhaps Canberra or Ottawa, whatever it is, want to maybe be kind of a nothing thing, but it's not fully in their control, perhaps. What it will
Quite.
mean, what this recognition will mean.
So, in a sense, it's taking a page from the Zionist textbook. I mean, David Ben-Gurion once said, the literature says, that the Zionists will establish their state one Dunham, one goat at a time.
Yes.
And this is a very pragmatic view. And I see no reason why the Palestinians shouldn't be operating under the same pragmatic approach. This is not to say that they look to Zionism as a model. No, not at all. Quite the opposite. It's something to be eschewed, and for good reason. But the fact of the matter is, we have very little tools at our disposal. So, like, take for example, like I'm a Canadian, so Canada has a free trade agreement with Israel, the terms of which define the territory of Israel as including the occupied Palestinian territory. And therefore, settlement products have access to the Canadian market tariff free. Well, the moment Palestine is recognized by Canada is the exact moment that the government of Canada has an obligation, not merely under international law, which it already does, right? Because these are erga omnes obligations to respect the Palestinian
And we
people's right
know
to
that also
self-determination and so on,
from
right?
EU litigation,
Right,
Western
exactly,
Sahara,
exactly.
yeah.
But it would be the moment that, as a matter of domestic law, because it's recognized the state of Palestine, it is obligated to abrogate and, at the very least, change and alter the bilateral agreement that it has with Israel on free trade. This is, to me, proof positive of the value of recognition, regardless of the situation on the ground, which everybody knows is absolutely dismal. The Palestinian people are sovereign, that's true, but their sovereignty, their ability to exercise their freedom as sovereigns, is being imposed and violated on by an aggressive, apartheid, genocidal power that the whole world, except the United States, realizes is on the outside looking in. And so you see a clash here between principle and the world on the one hand, and Israel and the United States on the other. And it's only a matter of time before all of this house of cards falls. The question is, at what cost?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I think you have answered, in a sense, most of my doctrinal questions, also about the sort of like the legal value of recognition. So I think I'll take us a little bit to history, also because I have learned a lot about your own work about history and international law in Palestine, because you said, in a sense, earlier in the podcast, you said that, in a sense, recognizing the state of Palestine is a response to the de facto one state solution that Israel is imposing on the ground, right? In which is asserting its right to rule from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea. And those who have obviously been following Palestine, either during, as you said, the last 23 months or perhaps for longer, will know that this talk about, the one state solution, the two-state solution is a big part of the conversation, right? And of course, recognizing the state of Palestine by many is seen exactly as step towards this so-called two-state solution, which means the idea that the most viable pathway to peace and security for everyone between the river and the sea is the creation of a Palestinian state alongside the state of Israel. And I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the history of this idea, and in particular, the history of this idea within international law. And I really learned a lot from your piece about the initial act of partition and international law, right? Because, in a sense, the first official international law version of the so-called state solution is the original partition or attempted partition of of mandatory Palestine by UN General Assembly Resolution 181-2 of 1947. So if you can give us a little bit of sense, because I think this might also help our listeners, excuse me, understand a bit better what you were saying about the complicities also of the UN in, the absolute carnage that we see unfolding the last 23 months, but also I would say the last 80 years.
Yes, absolutely. Great question. A big question, which I'll try and do justice to. I suppose the first place to begin is to ask ourselves what the context was against which the General Assembly purported to partition Palestine in 1947, November 29 of that year. I suppose, one must ask, what is Zionism? What was the Zionist movement trying to accomplish in the period between its initial beginning of organized settlement in Palestine from 1882 through to 1947? What were they trying to do? The Zionists were very clear. I mean, this is a movement of Central European Jews, many of them atheists, who said, look, we've been chased from pillar to post for centuries in Gentile Europe. The only way out of this conundrum is to establish our own self-determination unit somewhere, our own nation state. They modeled their nationalism, and Zionism as a national idea is modeled after sort of Germanic, ethnocentric, ethno-nationalism, where an ethnic group has their own nation state. And so after thinking about various places in the world to establish their state, with the help of colonial powers, whether it was or imperial powers, whether it was the Ottomans who they approached and without success, or the British and so on, they chose Palestine. And the key facts there that need to be kept in mind is the slow demographic shift from 1882 to 1947. So when the Balfour Declaration after World War I or just before the end of World War I, is given by the British government to the Zionist movement, where Her Majesty's government agrees in principle with the establishment in Palestine of a Jewish national home, being clear that nothing should be done, I'm now paraphrasing, that would violate the existing religious and civil rights of the, quote, existing non-Jewish population of the country. In 1917, when the British gave that promise in violation of the Nemo Dat principle, which many of your property lawyers will recognize, that one may not give what one does not possess, to the Zionists, the population of Palestine was about 3% Jewish, many of them newcomers from Europe, some of them indigenous, to be sure, indigenous Palestinian Arabic speakers, to about 97% Palestinian Arab, Christian, and Muslim. And between 1917 and the onset of the mandate in 1922, all the way up to 1947, when the British quit the mandate, that population ratio shifts. On the eve of the partition resolution of the United Nations General Assembly, Resolution 181 of 29 November 1947, the population of Palestine was about 1.5 million people, 1 million of whom were Palestinian Arabs, 500,000 of whom were Jews, Zionists, the vast, vast majority, 99% or so, newcomers from Europe, settlers from Central Europe.
And can I
And
say
what were
something
the
about the settler bit? That nowadays calling Zionism a settler colonial movement can be controversial in certain circles, at least. But it's really interesting when one reads literature from the time before colonialism became a bad word. Zionists were perfectly open about being engaged in a settler colonial enterprise, right? They described in Zionist material the colonization of Palestine, right? Which now is considered very often a controversial thing to say according to modern day Zionists. But at the time, it was clear to everyone that this was exactly what was happening. It is only because in the 60s and the 70s, anti-colonial movement made colonialism a bad word that Zionists retrospectively deny the label.
you're absolutely right, and I'm glad you've raised that. It is a matter of record, historical record, from the Zionist movement and its leadership, and for decades, that this was a settler colonial movement, right? They tried to link themselves up with European empire. They fashioned themselves in accordance with the same ideals of European empire. They modeled their national movement along the lines of the ethno-nationalism that was then the order of the day of the late 19th century. And what I found interesting was, with your permission, I'd like to read out a portion of my book. I've just pulled it up. I found a passage that was just remarkable. You know, as a researcher, when you find these nuggets in the archive, you sometimes you just are so pleased with yourself. And this was one that jumped right out at me. So imagine 1947, July, the United Nations Special Committee for Palestine, which is a special committee created by the General Assembly after the British have handed over the problem of Palestine to the UN, the newly formed UN. This special committee on Palestine was tasked with assessing what to do with the future government of Palestine. And then eventually they called it the Question of Palestine. And they took evidence. This committee was made up of a good number of jurists, one of whom was a member of Canada's Supreme Court, and from various countries. The Canadians were represented and so on. It was mostly Western states that were represented on this committee, shaped, of course, by the current General Assembly, which was dominated by the West and the imperial powers. But they came to Jerusalem and many places across Palestine and the Middle East, and they took evidence. And in July 1947, they took evidence from Chaim Weizmann. Now, those who are the historians here will understand who Chaim Weizmann was. He's one of the major founding leaders of the Zionist movement and one of maybe the top two, maybe three leaders of the Zionist movement in the first half of the 20th century, right? And he was a founder of the Jewish Agency. And so he gave evidence on the ostensible difficulties presented to the Zionist colonization during the Mandate period. And he says, quote, to UNSCOP in the UN record, other peoples have colonized great countries, rich countries. They found when they entered there backward populations. In olden times, such backward countries were built up by charter companies. All of you will remember the East Indian Charter Company. But charter companies were hard to fashion in 1918, the first quarter of the 20th century. The Wilsonian conception of the world certainly would not have allowed the charter company. Therefore, we had to create a substitute. This substitute was the Jewish Agency, which had the function of a chartered company, which had the function of a body which would conduct the colonization, immigration, improvement of the land, and do all of the work which a government usually does without really being a government. We had all the difficulties of a government and none of its advantages. The Jewish Agency was given a special position in the mandate. It was not much of a privilege. It was a great burden. And in effect, what he's demonstrating in 1947, in the period where the UN is ostensibly moving into a decolonization period, right? The post-Wilsonian conception of the world where self-determination of peoples as a political possibility matters. He's saying we had to continue our colonization effort. It was a Kipling-esque great burden on us. This was the white man's burden, and we succeeded. We succeeded at this. So, dear UNSCOP, do us a solid. Do us a favor, recognize the civilization we brought Palestine through our colonization efforts and grant us our state in this territory. Now, going back to the partition plan and the terms of that partition plan, if you look at the terms adopted by the General Assembly, they're patently violative of the principle of self-determination of a Class A mandated territory. It is true that self-determination of peoples at the time was not yet crystallized as an international norm. That took another 10 years to begin with the decolonization period from about 1955, and then the practice of states sort of developed this over the 60s and 70s. No, it was still a political postulate. However, there was a principle in 1945 very clearly of self-determination of peoples in Class A mandated territories that carried on from the League of Nations period. And there, from 1919, you have the provisional independence of Palestine and the people of Palestine being recognized by the League of Nations. The Palestinian people in 1919 are the vast majority of the population, right? They're the majority. So and going forward, even to the 1947, when the partition plan was adopted, the majority of the population, 2/3, were Palestinian Arabs. So to say that this territory should be partitioned, as the majority of UNSCOP suggested, what ran completely violative and ran completely against the principle of self-determination of peoples. However, could the people of Palestine exercise their right to self-determination if they'd made it very clear to UNSCOP that they do not want their country partitioned? The vast majority of people said that, and the majority of UNSCOP said no. So the terms are that, according to the majority of UNSCOP, there's a minority and a majority plan. The majority plan is that the 1/3 population of Jewish settlers should receive approximately 57% of Palestine, including its most fertile land on the coast. The 2/3 majority Palestinian Arab population should receive about 42%, 43% of the whole. And then there would be a corpus separatum, or an internationalized city established in Jerusalem. What's worse is that the population ratio in both the putative Jewish state and the putative Arab state would be, in the Arab state, a vast majority of Arabs. The preponderance of the population would be Arabs because they were the indigenous majority. There would only be about 10,000 Jews, Zionist Jews, living in this land of about 1 million Palestinian Arabs. But in the Jewish state, the proposed Jewish state, by the records of the United Nations, the population ratio would be as follows: 509,000 Palestinian Arabs to 499,000 Zionist Jews. So from the off, this Jewish state, which the United Nations General Assembly purported to establish through this partition plan, and which the terms of the partition plan, if you read Resolution 181 carefully, you'll see that each state formed would have to be a democratic state, guaranteeing rule of law, and so on. From the off, it would be a minority rule state where the Jews would be in the minority.
And
And
can I
however, is this going to
interject
go
here?
ahead?
But basically, it might be useful for our listeners to know that they did this through a weird accounting and ethnological system in which they said that Bedouins in Israel were not Arabs. Basically, they
Right.
said, well, no, actually, it's not an Arab majority because we have carved this group of people out and we have artificially created a supposed Jewish majority, right? And it
Exactly.
was not
Exactly.
something people understood as being correct, to put it like that.
Exactly. And it's still a myth. Even among historians, you'll see people go on and on about the fact that the population ratios weren't where they were. There was about 90,000 Bedouins or something like that, which made the number of Arabs in the country much smaller than the Jewish population. Not so. So you see this quest of the British initially, and then of the Western majority membership of UNSCOP, and then the Western majority of the UN General Assembly, to racially gerrymander the situation on the ground, create and stand up a Jewish state, was driven by something else. It had nothing to do with international law or self-determination of peoples. This was driven by a quest of a number of things: to establish a European imperial outpost in the Middle East that would give the British, in the initial term, a freehold and access to the jewel in the crown, which was India, of course, right? It's on the road. You needed to control access to the Suez Canal. You needed to control access to the Red Sea. You needed to control access to the Indian Ocean. You needed those trade routes. You needed access to the oil, which they were now standing up all of these sheikdoms in the Gulf and elsewhere. So this was a divide and rule policy, and the Zionist movement was an outpost, and by their terms, not mine. I mean, Theodore Herzl calls it an outpost of civilization against barbarism, by his own words, right? But then the United Nations General Assembly, at a time where we're meant to believe that with the UN Charter framework now in place, self-determination of people's human rights and so on, is now the shift in the global international ethos, right? This shift from the old imperial order to an order based on rule of law. We were told that that's what's going on. The General Assembly continues with this old method of working. And this is the replication of the old imperial decision-making form is made manifest in how the General Assembly chose to partition Palestine, and against the context where they knew very clearly and had received evidence from the British, who left unilaterally in August 1948 with all of their troops and all of their police, who knew full well that war would break out after partition was given. There are some other key facts that people often forget. The Zionists didn't even want partition. They say that they took it pragmatically, and that's true. I think they took a pragmatic decision to accept it in the same way that I think recognition is important to accept now, going back to our earlier conversation. They did it pragmatically, but they were very clear. In the evidence given to UNSCOP, Ben-Gurion made it very clear in 1947. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, "We don't want partition. We want the whole.
Yeah.
And we don't want you to declare independence in Palestine now because we are a minority population. What we want is a UN trusteeship over the territory until such time as we become the majority population. And when that happens, then we can have our independence." He's very open and honest about this. This is the demographic battle, and all of this evidence is before the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. And yet they persist with the folly of their partition plan. There is a minority plan, which I've not had a chance to talk about it, but the minority plan, which was advanced by Yugoslavia, Iran, and India, argued that there should be a single state from the river to the sea, a binational state, and so on. And unfortunately, because they didn't command a majority of global South states, which didn't exist yet in the General Assembly, it didn't pass, right?
Yes.
There was an attempt to seek an advisory opinion by the Egyptians and the Syrians of the legality of the partition plan before it was adopted. And that was quashed by a very close vote of the Western group, the WEOG group, what is now called the WEOG group in the General Assembly. So the ICJ was never given an opportunity to declare, which they would have very clearly, the partition plan unlawful and ultra vires the General Assembly. But in answer to your question, and I'll wind up here, this event set in motion the Nakba, which began 3 days later, after it began on the 2nd of December, I think, 1947. 18 months of that, 80% of the Palestinian population is driven from their homes, as was foretold by the Zionists, by the British who were on the ground, who had the evidence of what would transpire. Palestinians they were defenseless for the most part. That took place. And it's because of that.
Explain to listeners, just to I'm sorry for cutting you here, but for context, basically, and again, Ben-Gurion had made that very clear from the beginning, that he wasn't comfortable with more than a 20% minority, Palestinian minority in the state, right? For obvious reasons, that if that state was going to be anything like resembling a democracy, Palestinians would take over, right? Due to majority. So, and basically by the end of the Nakba, that's what happens. Because of forced expulsion, or either directly or because people feared for their lives, for their safety. So some people packed up and left, and some people were forcibly removed. That's roughly what happens by the end of the Nakba, right? The Palestinians did remain within Israel, but in much, much more reduced numbers, and pretty much the numbers that Ben-Gurion said was his upper limit of tolerance.
Quite right. And I mean, just moving it forward, you see that from that day forth, November 29, 1947, you have introduced in the UN system this idea of two states, two national groups with rights. Now, it took a while for the Israelis established their state through an act of state secession, effectively, had it recognized, became a member of the United Nations. Those debates are poured over by me in chapter 6 of my book. But the Palestinian state just was never recognized. Even though they had a right to that state as far back as 1919. And so you get into the development of the question of Palestine from that period onward is an attempt by the Palestinians perennially to establish their right and have it recognized to self-determination in their homeland against a settler colonial movement that wants only its destruction, a nuclear power now that very clearly is not going to allow it, come what may, willingly. And so this is the conundrum. The Palestinians have had, for instance, in 1988, PLO recognized the state of Israel after many years of arguing that there should be a single democratic state from the river to the sea, which is a wonderful idea and one that I even espouse to. but they had to accept the state of Israel in that territory if they were going to even get recognition of modicum of their rights. And from the late 70s into the late 80s and even to the present, you have more and more states now recognizing the state of Palestine, where the only thing stopping the state of Palestine from existing is two things. Well, one thing, Israel, because it just doesn't want it to. It's destroying it with reckless abandon. And then politically, the United States is blocking membership of the State of Palestine at the Security Council in the United Nations. But otherwise, it is a full member, fledged member of the international community. It appears before the International Court of Justice. I'm proof positive of that. Only states can appear before the ICJ. It has a rich treaty practice. It acts like a state. It is a state on the international plane. It just isn't free by virtue of an illegal, aggressive, occupying power that is engaged in genocide against its people.
Thank you so much. Okay, I have taken enough of your time. I have one final question. I will link to your own work for our readers to dig deeper, but I also want to ask you for your own suggestions. What would you recommend for our listeners to read if they want to educate themselves more about Palestine, either Palestine in international law, or I would say about the history of Palestine more broadly? What is, do you think, the go-to, especially maybe for beginners, so to speak?
Great question. I'll start with the general. There are two books that I would recommend on the general history of the modern Palestinian people and so on. The first is a dated volume, but still very, very worth looking at, and that's Edward Said's The Question of Palestine. Edward Said, The Question of Palestine. And then a much more contemporary new work done by Palestine's greatest historian, at least living, Rashid Khalidi, The 100 Years' War on Palestine, which was just out, I think, last year. I had the great delight and honor to receive a copy from Rashid when I gave him a copy of my book. In a sense, my book is the international law sort of sequel, sister brother volume to his 100 Years' War on Palestine. So for those who want to look at the international law on Palestine and the question of Palestine, there are three books that I would recommend. Hesitatingly, my own book, The United Nations and the Question of Palestine. But I would begin with Victor Catan's book, From Coexistence to Conquest. This treats the formative years, the late 19th century and the early 20th century, very closely on the international law prevailing on Palestine. And then my book would pick up from the interwar years onward to the present. And then there's a really very good monograph. A second one was done by Noura Arakat, Justice for Some, Stanford University Press. I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago. Very, very well done. Looks at a lot of the similar themes that Victor and I do, but spends a little bit more time looking at the U.S. engagement on the question of Palestine, especially post 1967. And I think Noura is well placed to do that by virtue of her being U.S. based. Victor, of course, is London based, and I'm based elsewhere in the colonies in Ottawa. So, here we are coming from the United States, from the United Kingdom, and from Canada, speaking back, as it were, to the metropole.
Absolutely. We will provide links to all these resources, as well as to your own Stanford piece on the partition. It's a terrific piece with some truly shocking quotes from the UN deliberations. The level of racism in open display, I consider myself to have like a tough stomach, and I was still sort of like surprised, as you say, especially about the fact that this debate happens after 45 and people are so openly racist in the UN. Okay, thank you so much for your time. Thanks to everyone for listening.